Jai Hind, Namaste, hello and a very warm welcome to UPSC for everyone. My name is Abhinav and in this video we'll be discussing the Hindu and Indian Express for the date 4th of November 2020. Now for your convenience I have added timestamps in the description, so if you want to skip to a particular news, please use those timestamps. And free PDFs for selected topics are available on my Telegram channel, the link to which is in the description. Also, if you like our videos, please subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon so that you don't miss out on any new videos that we post. And please give us a thumbs up if you like this video. So without wasting your time, let's get started. So starting with the Hindu, states cannot make isolated plans for vaccine distribution. This is what the health ministry has said, and it has asked states from refraining to do so. Why? Because they are making a central plan. If you remember, we have discussed use of even and tracking of the vaccine, right? From the source to the beneficiary. Then we discussed the SMS alert system where the beneficiaries or the persons who would be getting the vaccine, they could take appointments and set up date when to get the vaccine shots, right? And it would probably be a 2-shot thing, right? And that has the whole plan has been made by an expert committee. So they are making elaborate plans. It also includes monitoring the labs, the temperature at which the vaccine is being stored. So they have elaborate plans. That is why they are asking states not to do so, right? So states had been asked to work with the central government, which has set up an expert committee on vaccine administration and to adhere to directions from the center. And if you remember, states have been asked to identify the beneficiaries, because in the first phase, only the priority beneficiaries would be getting, like the frontline workers and health workers, they would be getting the vaccine. They had been advised to create a database according to the blueprint issued by the central government and also to take stock of the storage and transport facility for the distribution. So this is all the part of the infrastructure which would go into making the vaccination operation successful, right? The expert committee, besides using the infrastructure of immunization program, is also looking at infrastructure and manpower support that private players can offer. We have discussed this as well, because private players, they have their expertise, so they could also be leveraged for this purpose, right? And we've also discussed how they would be using the existing plans or existing structures for immunization. For example, the national immunization program, the Indradhanush program, right? We've discussed that as well, right? And the PM said that we should be preparing for this vaccination drive as if we are preparing for the poll. So they have made elaborate plans. Then this unfortunate news: convicted IS supporter kills 4 in Vienna rampage. So now terrorists have struck Vienna, right? Right now the police does not know how many attackers were there in total. One they have shot down, right? Now see the statement that has been made by the Chancellor, Sebastian Kurz: hunt down the perpetrators and those who stand behind them. The attack yesterday was clearly an Islamic terror attack. Now see his statement, very balanced. This is not a conflict between Christians and Muslims or between Austrians and immigrants. And you compare this with the statements from people like Mahathir and Erdogan, right? Now Erdogan said that the Christians are trying to again revive the crusades. Now what kind of a stupid statement is that, right? And Mahathir said that the Muslims have the right to kill French. So you see, it is not the European people who are Islamophobic. You have to understand this. These are the stupid leaders who are misleading the people, right? No, this is a fight between many people who believe in peace and a few who oppose it. It is a fight between civilization and barbarianism. The attacker was identified as Kudchim Fejula, a dual citizen of Austria and North Macedonia. He was sentenced to 22 months in jail in April 2019 for attempting to travel to Syria to join the IS, but released in December. And now IS has come up and taken the responsibility for this attack. Then governor can rule on Rajiv convicts pleas. Probe into larger conspiracy does not concern convicts, says Supreme Court. So these convicts in the Rajiv Gandhi assassination case, they have been making pleas for release, for mercy pleas, but the decision was not taken in the name of a larger inquiry. Now Supreme Court has said that governor should take a decision. The court also said that we will not take a decision by ourselves, because under Article 161, the governor is already considering this fact, but governor should now take a decision fast. Now, the president also has the power to pardon. His powers come under Article 72, right? And governor's powers are under Article 161. But president has far greater powers to pardon than the governor, because president can pardon the death sentence and also court martials, something the governor cannot do, right? So this is about the plea by these convicts to be released. Then amended J&K land laws have built-in safeguards. So this is what the Lieutenant Governor of J&K has said. There is an interview of his. You can read it. There is nothing rocket science about it. Then page 6 editorial, A Fragile French Republic. Now from this editorial, we'll select some particular points because this person, he's coming out as apologetic that it is France who's responsible for these attacks that are happening on France. Now this is a very, very bad approach because what happens, this approach enables the terrorists and the extremists to carry on with their program. So we'll see some selected parts from it. Basically, we'll look at the concept of lessee and the role of teachers in the French society, especially when it comes to lessee. That is all that we are going to do because he tells that there are only two approaches. Either you compromise or go for conflict. And he's favoring compromise, that the French society should compromise on its principles and its values to accommodate people, right? Now, this should not happen because if somebody is coming to your home, they should be adopting to your principles, not the other way around, right? So again, this is the problem with some so-called intellectuals. So we'll just look at certain parts from it. So let us see. Now talking about the role of teachers, since the start of the Third Republic in 1870, teachers have been at the forefront of the French state's mission to unify the diverse population. In recent decades, teachers have been charged to trying to integrate France's Maorite ethnic minority communities because France is home to many communities and it has experienced influx of many immigrants, right? And often they see themselves as engine of social unity, teachers, in a notoriously divided country. Of the many things that teachers are expected to do, one of the most important is to embody the principles of lessee. Now, what is lessee? Often translated as secularism, it is better understood as a project of social cohesion and a key component of French citizenship. So if you want to take French citizenship, you should subscribe to this ideology. It encompasses not simply the formal separation of church and the state, but it also evacuation of religious values from the public space and their replacement with secular values such as liberty, equality and fraternity, which were the main themes of the French Revolution, right? Liberty, equality and fraternity, and these words also find place and mention in our preamble, and that has been directly influenced by the French Revolution, right? Now these are the ideas on which the Republic was established. Now how can you go back on them just to accommodate people of different ideology? No. If they are coming to your country, they should follow these ideologies because these are modern ideologies, not barbaric ideologies, right? Even if you have a difference of opinion, you can write a dissent note, you can carry on peaceful protests. What is the point of beheading? Again, coming back to it. Indeed, for many people today, lessee is mainly about Islam. Now, here he starts getting somewhat apologetic. So I'm not getting much into it. You can read it if you want for your own intellectual development and you can come to your own conclusions. This reflects France's recent history. The decolonization of French colonies in Africa in the 1950s and 60s brought the problem of Islam into sharp focus as the French tried and failed to manage Muslims in unprecedented numbers. Now see, he is basically verifying or sort of, giving legitimacy to what Mahathir had said, that the Muslims have the right to kill French in millions because French might have killed Muslims in the past. So this is the problem with intellectuals. France was the site of violence that spilled over from the Algerian Civil War in 1990s. Around the same time, it experienced a series of public controversies over the wearing of hijab in state schools and other public places. These factors hardened attitudes towards both Islam and lessee. France thereafter became a prime target in the new wave of global Islamist violence that took off in the early 2000s. France thereafter became a prime target of the new wave of global Islamic violence that took off in the early 2010s. But if you remember, we also discussed an editorial in which it was mentioned that in Britain, there was no such laws against burkini, burqa, etc. But it faced greater number of terrorist attacks than France. So the reason is something else, not this. Now again, coming to solution, he says either you compromise or you go for conflict. Macron is taking this approach and he should be, because it is about the existence of the original idea of the French Republic. If you compromise, then you are basically compromising on the whole idea, right? So this person is advocating compromise. Rest you read it, and if you feel like, you can make your own idea about it. Uncivil proposal. So this is about the so-called love jihad and whatnot. Again, these people are being prophetic, so I'm not getting into it because these are stupid ideas. You want to read, you read. You want to form your opinion, you form your opinion. Then hitting fossil fuel companies where it hurts. Now, this is an interesting read by Miss Sujata. Now, she has basically traced how, using a method called disinvestment, the global environmental movement is trying to cripple the oil companies, which are the major contributors to the pollution, right? So she has given some points. So we'll look at it in parts, right? So the whole theme is disinvestment in oil companies. Disinvestment means pulling out money from the oil companies. If you cripple these oil companies financially, then why would they function? Because the ultimate motivation for functioning for any company is money, right? So if they don't have money, or if they have problems in accessing funding, then that would cripple their operation. That is what she's telling, and she's giving us examples about various initiatives, right? So first of all, she tells us about the present worth of companies. For example, Saudi's Aramco 2019 had 101.1 billion, and then other companies, right? Then she says that the arguments for disinvestment in India do not apply at this time because our per capita greenhouse gas emissions are very, very low, right? But she says that it is a good opportunity for India because the costs of production and storage of renewables are falling precipitously, and we therefore need to plan. And she says that this process will be complex and necessarily involve many sectors and activities, including land restoration, local jobs, and timely transfer of storage technologies for renewable energy, apart from dealing with entrenched vested and political interests. So these are the points on which we have to work to enable renewable energy on a large scale. And she says that this is the right time for India to start making this transition, right? Then she talks about how activists, philanthropists, etc. are undertaking systematic organized drives for disinvestment from fossil fuel companies. So first, disinvestment is the process by which money put into stocks and bonds of certain companies is withdrawn. In this case, disinvestment has been directed against companies that extract, refine, sell, and make profits from fossil fuels. So all the oil producing companies as well as the ones who are into refining, right? The purpose is to restrict fossil fuel companies' ability to function with no regard for their impact on climate change. The disinvestment operations targeted large investment funds. Now she is giving examples of the philanthropical, education, and other funds that are working in this direction. And she's telling us that as of 2019, it is estimated that more than $11 trillion in assets has been committed to disinvestment from fossil fuels. Then she says that there is need for targeting banks that provide loans to fossil fuel groups. And she says that it has been quite successful. And she gives an example of Goldman Sachs, which basically recently said that they won't be financing any project that is taking drilling operations in the Arctic region. So Goldman Sachs announced no longer finance new oil drilling in Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, and also not provide capital for some of the worst kinds of coal mines such as mountaintop mining. Then she's talking about some report, 2020 report of banking on climate change by Rainforest Action Network, that global banks continue to finance the fossil fuel industry with $2.7 trillion. So this is the problem, right? So that is what she is telling us, that there is high funding by US and Chinese companies and financial institutions, including banks, into these projects, these fossil fuel projects. So banks supporting companies that are expanding fossil fuels, including new kinds of fuels and in new places. A total of 975 billion was the banking finance for 100 key oil and gas companies between 2016 and 19. Then she's again talking about the report. So this is how the banks are continuing to support the oil and gas industry. Now she says that the efforts are having an effect, and this can be seen from the statements made in various finance and investment related documents. For example, according to a recent report of the Climate Related Market Risk Subcommittee, climate change poses a major risk to the stability of the US financial system. So she says regulators need to assess and understand and act on them. Then she gives an example of JP Morgan, that the company would help clients navigate the challenges and capitalize on long-term economic and environmental benefits of a low-carbon world. The bank proposed establishing a center for carbon transition and setting intermediate emission targets for 2030 for its financing portfolio. So these banks and financial institutions are coming under pressure to go for green investments and basically put money in projects that are green. Companies going bankrupt state that the disinvestment movement is making it difficult to raise capital. Shell, for instance, considers the movement a material risk. So then she says that when banks and investors they begin to shift away from fossil fuel companies because they become risky business, then the campaign must be having an effect. Now she's saying that the disinvestment movement against the banks is gathering steam. Big names are backing this. Now how much of an impact it will have, let us see. Then on page 7, Academia and the Free Will, India's dismal score on Academic Freedom Index reflects the issue plaguing the country's education system. Now again, this Academic Freedom Index, it is not a very credible source because it is done by private individuals, and I'll just show you why. Secondly, this is very, very prophetic, right? So that is why I'm not getting much into it. I'll just tell you about the AFI. Rest you can read. Nothing substantial here, right? He's just making opinions and comments upon something which is not substantiated. So this index and the accompanying report try to quantify the freedom of university scholars to debate politically and culturally controversial topics without fearing their safety or studies and without any external influence on the institution's affairs based on combination of factual data and assessment of 1800 academicians worldwide. See, now this is the problem. Number one, factual data. They are not telling what kind of a factual data they are using. It could be based on newspaper reports. Then again, every newspaper is carrying its own ideology, right? And then the academicians assessment. Again, academicians, they have their different views and whatnot. So this is not something that can be substantiated hard facts, right? It uses 8 categories. Out of those 8, only 3 are based on factual data. Number one, the veracity and the tenacity of the factual data in itself is not very accurate. And number 2, then the survey by academicians, what sort of opinion they could be giving. There could be many factors. That is why I'm not much interested into discussing this. Had it been by some renowned institution or global body, then we would have discussed this in detail. Now the index has maximum value of 1 and AFI has 8 components. 3 are based on factual data and the remaining 5 are expert coded. Now see this, there is a problem called expert because everyone is an expert. They are based on 1810 scholars assessment integrated into Bayesian measurement model. Now you don't need to know what is this model. The components are freedom to research and teach, freedom of academic exchange and dissemination, institutional autonomy, campus integrity, freedom of academic and cultural expression. So these are the 8 pillars. Only 3 are based on facts. Rest on are the survey reports that are filed by experts, right? So that is the problem here. Now India has scored considerably low in the International Academic Freedom Index with a score of only 0.352. This is a scale from 0 to 1. Maximum is 1. We are at 0.352, which is closely followed by Saudi Arabia and Libya. In the last 5 years, the AFI of India has dipped by 0.1 points. Again, see, you and I are also living in this country. So do you agree with this? If you do, good for you. Then he is again taking a pot shot at NEP that it promises autonomy and flexibility, but would it really happen? What not? So this is what it is saying. Nothing substantial for you to basically take away from this. But if you want, if you have the time, you can read this. Then this one, South tops in governance. So Kerala was the best governed state with Uttar Pradesh was the poorest in 2009 among large states according to the recently released Public Affairs Index 2020. I will just tell you about this index. It has higher credibility than the AFI we just discussed. The index measures the quality of governance at the state UT level on 3 dimensions. What are the 3 dimensions? Equity, growth and sustainability using 50 indicators. Among the small states, Goa was ranked the highest while Manipur the lowest. So this is the map, right? Now equity index, we see 3 pillars: equity, growth and sustainability. So this index is computed using 23 social, economic and gender related indicators. such as malnutrition, women in legislatures, slum population, and crimes against SC/ST. The number before a state depicts its rank. So they are talking about the rank here in terms of equity index, right? Then growth index, it is computed using 20 indicators such as expense on agriculture, student teacher ratio, drinking water, sanitation, electricity availability, fiscal deficit, and unemployment rate, again ratings. And sustainability index, this index is computed using 7 indicators. So in all 50 indicators for 3 major indexes using the renewable energy, land degradation, waste management, and air quality. So who releases the Public Affairs Index? Public Affairs Center, a not-for-profit organization based in Bengaluru. What does it measure? Governance in states and UTs. How are the states ranked? So it uses 3 pillars we just discussed, 5 themes and 50 indicators. It maps the indicators to the SDGs relevant to Indian states. So this is about that. Then page 10, Indian Navy matches skills with 3 foreign fleets of Vizag. So this is basically about the Malabar exercise. Now here the important point is Mission Sagar 2. The Navy also began Mission Sagar 2, under which INS Airavate entered the Sudan port carrying 100 tons of food. Under the mission, India provides assistance to friendly countries during the COVID-19 pandemic. Sagar 2 is a follow-up mission of Sagar undertaken in May-June 2020, during which India delivered food and medicines to Maldives, Mauritius, the Seychelles, Madagascar, and Comoros. So this is basically Indian Ocean region where India is supplying. So this is important for your PT as well as for your international affairs paper 2, how India is acting or helping the countries in the Indian Ocean region, because we say that Indian Ocean region is our strategic backyard. So what kind of efforts are we taking, right? So this is about that. Then again, parties free to engage in political activity in J&K. There is no proscription. So this is the interview of the Lieutenant Governor of J&K. You can read this, nothing rocket science here. It is just a dialogue. That is why I am not getting into it. Then more children to get fortified rice. Now this is important. Let us see. So the children in Anganwadis and government schools could soon be eating rice infused with iron, folic acid, and vitamin B12. See, these are all micronutrients which are very, very important. I have discussed with you that nutrition involves both macronutrients being your carbs, fats, and proteins. There should be a good balance in it. And then micronutrients, because these micronutrients are very, very important for proper functioning of your body, including hormonal functions, and also for absorption of these macronutrients that you take. Now, so many children from the weak backgrounds, they don't get enough of these micronutrients. So government has come up with plans to give these micronutrients to students. If you remember, yesterday we discussed about the midday meal scheme. Even that scheme had component of giving micronutrients to the students, at least 12 grams of protein. If you remember, we discussed yesterday only, and that covers around 450 kilocalories, and the whole is 1/3 of the nutrition requirements of a child, right? Now coming back to it, in a bid to combat chronic anemia and undernutrition, the government is planning to distribute fortified rice through integrated child development services. If you remember, 0 to 3-year kids and pregnant and lactating mothers are covered under this scheme, right? This is about their nutrition and also preschool education. So this is the integrated child development service. And next is the midday meal schemes I just told you about, and we discussed about it in yesterday's video as well. Across the country from next year, with a special focus on 112 aspirational districts. The Food Corporation of India has been asked to come up with comprehensive plan to scale up annual supply of fortified rice, because under these schemes, the offtake, the grain offtake and the supply is done by FCI. FCI basically takes grains from the farmers and different mandis, stores them, then states come to FCI and they offtake their share for implementing these schemes. Now underway in 5 states. So basically it was being run on a pilot basis in 15 districts. Now out of those 15 districts, it is only running in 5 districts in the states of Andhra Pradesh, Gujarat, Maharashtra, Tamil Nadu, and Chhattisgarh. Now this is very, very important. What is rice fortification? It involves grinding broken rice into powder, then mixing it with nutrients and then shaping it into rice-like kernels using an extrusion process. So you basically grind rice first, then you mix it with nutrients, then you again shape it like rice kernels, right? These fortified kernels are then mixed with normal rice in 1:100 ratio. So this is important. So what ratio? 1:100, because there should be a balance in your micronutrients as well. Excess of everything is bad. So if there is excess of micronutrients in your diet, it can also lead to problems, right? And then distribute it for consumption. So this is about rice fortification. Again, a good initiative by government. Then page 12, this app puts safety first. So this filmmaker Madhurita Anand, she made an app free. Now this is important for women's safety, right? You can use this as a role of technology in women's safety, or role of technology in safety, or initiatives for women's safety. And these are people's initiative or private sector initiative. So basically free is an app that lets users rate places for safety. See, blue, black, this is the color code. They rate some place on the basis of their perceived safety of that place, and they also give reasons, right? So according to NCRB data, crimes against women increased from 3,78,000 cases in 2018 to 4,05,000 cases. On this app, users can rate a specific building or entire area from the map for safety. They can also describe the reasons for their rating. Unsafe places are marked red and the safe ones in blue, and the unrated places in gray. The app also has an SOS feature. So see, this is very important, and small changes like lighting of streets, it can make huge difference when it comes to preventing crimes against women, right? So this is a good initiative. Then page number 13, Qatar Emir sets first national election for next October. Nation's 2004 constitution calls for vote to Shura Council. So basically the Shura Council is there to aid and advise the ruler of Qatar. So a long delayed vote for the country's policy reviewing chamber will be held in October 2021, marking the Gulf Emirates' first national election. The currently unelected Shura Council advises the absolute ruler, Emir Sheikh, on draft laws, but does not create its own legislation and can be overruled by a simple decree. Now, October's vote would be Qatar's first national election. Qataris have previously been able to cast ballots on constitutional reforms and in elections to a nationwide municipal council. Elections to the council required under the country's 2004 constitution have been postponed repeatedly, and the body's members have instead been directly appointed by Emir. Cautious reform. Qatar has undergone cautious reform on issues including democracy, worker rights, and representation of women since Sheikh Tamim came to power in 2013. So see, there are different facets of Islamic world. It is a very wrong thing to assume that everyone is barbaric. It is only a minute minority within this Islamic community that are engaging in this despicable acts of terrorist attacks. Rest, they're trying to reform themselves. You look at Saudi, you look at Qatar, and every major Islamic country has its own version of Islam. So there is nothing wrong if France also wants to have its own version of Islam, right? Then 6 locations in central Vienna attacked, 2 arrested from nearby town, at least 1 gunman still on the loose. This is what the minister is saying. Again, this is about the unfortunate attacks, and this Islamic State claims responsibility. Then Sri Lanka rescues 120 stranded whales. It was as if the whales were stuck in a treadmill, says marine biologist. So if you remember, we have already discussed about the whale stranding, because probably they use their sonar system and in shallow waters that gets distorted, or probably one member of the pod or the whole pod gets disoriented, especially again near the shallow waters, right? And that is how they get stuck. Again, here the whale is the short-finned pilot whales. We discussed this in case of Australia as well, right? So Sri Lanka's Navy, Coast Guard, local volunteers and conservation experts have rescued nearly 120 stranded whales and pulled them back to deep sea. The marine mammals were short-finned pilot whales that are said to be found in Pacific, Atlantic and Indian Oceans. So this is where the stranding has taken place, right? Panadurga, which is somewhat close to Colombo. This is the location, right? So first of all, what are beaching stranding events? They refer to a phenomenon of dolphins and whales stranding themselves on beaches. There are around 2,000 strandings each year worldwide, most resulting in death. Whales strand themselves on beach either singularly or in groups. Individual strandings are mostly attributed to injury or sickness. It is not clear why exactly they strand themselves in groups. Now, what are the possible reasons? Nobody knows for sure. Number one, some whales follow schooling fish or other prey into shallow waters, which causes the whales to become disoriented, as a result of which they get stranded. Another reason could be panic from being trapped by a predator such as killer whales or sharks. Another possibility is that whales might be drawn to land by prey-rich currents. Some scientists believe that sonar signals and other man-made loud underwater noises may contribute to beaching events. And further, the shape of the beach and coastlines could also play a role. And you see, these whales, they are basically, these pilot whales, they are basically dolphins. They are very, very socially attached to each other, both whales and dolphins. So if one member of the pod gets stuck, then all the members, they follow that member, and then there are mass suicides and mass strandings. Now about short-finned pilot whales, they are nicknamed as cheetahs of the deep sea for their deep, high-speed sprint drives to chase and capture large squid, and that is their main prey, right? They follow it. Pilot whales are extraordinarily social. Their strong bonds motivate them to stick together through thick and thin, even when that means putting themselves at risk. That is what leads to mass strandings in some cases. Other names are pothead whale and blackfish, IUCN conservation status least concerned. Now, why are they called pilot whales? They got their name from the old theory that the pod was piloted by a single leader. Now this pod is the group of whales. It is known as pod. We now know that this is not the case, but the name has stuck. Pilot whales are actually large dolphins, like I told you. They are second largest member of the oceanic dolphin family. Short-finned pilot whales are found globally in tropical and temperate oceans, warmer seas than those preferred by long-finned pilot whales. So this is their region, right? And this is the region of long-finned pilot whales. They can be found at varying distances from the shore, but typically prefer deeper waters where most squid live. They are generally nomadic and follow the movements of the squid. Resident pilot whales have been recorded in places such as Hawaii and California. Now, what are the main threats? I'm just going to read the big headings. Rest you can read from the PDFs from my Telegram channel. So, strandings, hunting, noise pollution, entanglement in nets and other fishing gear, and captivity. So, you can get the PDF from my Telegram channel and you can download it and then you can read it at your own convenience. Then page 14, exports fall again on global trade woes. October shipment dips 5.4%, imports slide. Data reflects weak demand overseas and in India. So basically India's merchandise exports slid back to contraction. Why? Because again, lockdowns are happening in Europe and they are experiencing a second wave. As struggling global trade continued to face headwinds from COVID-19 pandemic, imports also shrunk, we've also seen. Then PM to meet 20 large global investors. Again, this is one of our moves to increase the ease of doing business in India. And when PM would be meeting investors, so it would be like a personal touch to it and a more personal assurance that their investments would be safe in India, right? So Prime Minister Modi will chair a virtual meeting with 20 large global investors managing assets of more than $6 trillion to reiterate India's attractiveness as an investment destination. The virtual conference with the investors, which includes several sovereign wealth funds and pension funds, will be followed by one-to-one interactions for each one of them by PM over the next 2 weeks. Now, the idea is to have an interaction with global investors, some of whom have been investing in India and others who are participating for the first time and are interested to know more so they can take a decision about investments. If they have any concerns, we will try to answer them. We have been interacting with these funds for the last 5 or 6 months. India's FDI flows between April and August had hit a record high despite the pandemic, rising 13% to more than 35 billion. And we've seen that there has been high FDI in the real estate sector, right? And also in form of investments into companies. So many companies have received FDI and funding from abroad during this period. Just the headline, economy is recovering fast, says Secretary Bajaj. So if you want, you can read it. Nothing great here. Now starting with the Indian Express. Now terror in Vienna, gunman on rampage kills 4, 14 arrested. So we have already discussed this in the Hindu, right? Then directly to page 4. Here we will get to know the center's stand on building the new Vista, the new Parliament House. What are they saying, right? So these statements were made by the Solicitor General, Mr. Tushar Mehta, in the Supreme Court. So he's basically outlining the center stand. So let us see what it is. So, underlying the cost and infrastructure advantage of the proposed Central Vista redevelopment project, the centre told the Supreme Court that the question whether or not to have a new parliament building is a policy decision which the government is entitled to take. So, number one, they are saying that it is what? A policy decision that they can take. So, no need for interference of the courts or any other body. The policy decision to have all central ministries at one place, and that place has to be one which is historically significant. That is why they cannot build parliament building in Gurgaon, Noida or some other place. It has to be a central place and a historical place. Now, on the contention that there was no design competition for the project, the Solicitor General stated that these are usually held for projects like war memorials, etc., which are monuments and do not serve functional purposes. For the Central Vista project, there was a concept competition as the building proposed are functional and not ornamental. So that is why they did not have a design competition, because it is a functional building and not ornamental building, right? Then contending that there is imminent need for a new parliament, he said that the current one was built in 1927 to house the Legislative Council and was not intended to house a bicameral legislature that the country has today. Again, a very important point, because these councils, they were unicameral, right? So now we have a bicameral system. So it is not intended to house bicameral legislature. Now, what does unicameral and bicameral means? Unicameral means that only one house of the parliament, and bicameral means that there are two houses. One is the upper house or the Rajya Sabha, and the lower house, the Lok Sabha, right? Now, the current building will be under more stress when the number of seats of Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha are raised, and this is going to happen after 2024, because a fresh delimitation exercise would be taken up and the number of parliamentary seats would be increased to basically reflect the population changes in India. Both houses are already packed and members have to sit on plastic chairs when joint sessions are held, diminishing the dignity of the house. So these are the points that Centre is making. Number one, they said it is a policy decision. Number two, they said that regarding design competition, it is not an ornamental building. Then number three, this building was old and it was built for a unicameral structure, not for a bicameral parliament as we have today, right? And then number five, they are saying that even if there are joint sittings or joint sessions, then other members have to sit on plastic chairs, which diminishes the dignity of the house. And it is true. See, it is not about the facility for parliamentarians or their own comfort. Whatever proceedings happen in the parliament, they are televised and they are used by different channels and the world watches it. So we wouldn't want our parliamentarians to be sitting on plastic chairs, right? So that is the point that they're making. Then number six, that the existing building does not conform to fire safety norms. Water and sewer lines are also haphazard, and this is damaging its heritage nature. He sought to highlight the security concerns in the wake of 2001 Parliament attack. It is also not quake proof. So this building is not following fire safety norms. It is not quake proof. There are security concerns, and then there are problems with the sewer lines, and all of this is taking a toll on the heritage nature of this building. Again, a very important point. Then the next point is on the cost advantage of having a new central secretariat building. Said many central ministries are housed in different buildings, with the result that the government ends up paying rent for many of them. The new building will help avoid this. So rent saving. The fact that people and offices have to run around the city to go different ministries also increases traffic and pollution. The project proposes interlinking of metro stations, which will minimize the use of vehicles. Again, a very important point, that it is saving cost in terms of rent. Yes, saving rent, saving fuel cost, as well as time, and also helping to solve the pollution and congestion problem, right? Then next point, referring to the land remaining unutilized in Central Vista, he said it is a criminal waste of space seeking to allay fears on environmental concerns. If the petition concern is environmental protection, I will say that it is fully taken care of. So land is being utilized and environmental concerns are also being fully taken care of. He said a detailed traffic management plan was also placed before the expert appraisal committee before clearance was granted. The project will be in different phases with construction deadlines. The construction of the new parliament building has a 2022 deadline, and the new parliament is a standalone project, right? Now please pay attention. Explaining this, he said ownership of the parliament building is with Lok Sabha Secretariat. So ownership is with Lok Sabha Secretariat, and considering the fact that numerous occupants and Lok Sabha speakers have indicated issues and inadequacies with the present structure, there was no need for a separate independent study. And basically, center is saying that if you are living in a house and you feel that there is a need to renovate that house, you don't call experts to tell you that you need to renovate that house. So that is why center is not calling any experts and then going for new construction. So this case is in the Supreme Court. This is the stand of the center. So anybody who's going to write mains this year, these are important points for you. Again, a very important article on page 6. Accurate forecast helps farmers, fishermen save crores, says survey. So the total annual income benefits to agricultural households, farmers and livestock owners taken together from accurate weather forecasting by the Indian Meteorological Department and other agencies working under the Ministry of Earth Sciences has been calculated at rupees 13,331 crore, and incremental benefits over the next 5 years is estimated to be about rupees 48,000 crore for this community according to a study conducted by the ministry. So see, that is the importance of our investment in infrastructures and technologies like weather forecasting, right? Because the benefits are immense. Apart from saving lives, they are also contributing to economic growth. Yes. Annual income gained by fisher folk, meanwhile, is estimated to be rupees 663 crore, and the present value of benefits accruing to these households works out to rupees 2,391 crore over a 5-year period. Now, these findings are part of a study carried out by National Council of Applied Economic Research. This is a reputed institute on behalf of Ministry of Earth Sciences to evaluate economic benefits of government's investments in the National Monsoon Mission, which was launched in 2012. So this basically was about using different technologies and methodologies to go for more accurate forecasting of the monsoon and weather. See, even today, nobody totally understands the function and the mechanism of how the Indian monsoon works. There are different factors or the probabilities that affect the intensity and the range. So it is still under study. So when we'll discuss, I'll tell you as of now what all we know, but still it is an evolving study. Weather is the most inaccurate science. You should never basically curse these people because they tell you to the best of their abilities, but weather is a very dynamic science. It is not very possible to have a very high accuracy in terms of weather forecasting, yet they are doing a very good job. The government has so far invested around rupees 1,000 crore in the mission. Now, the NCAER is an independent not-for-profit economic policy research think tank based in National Capital. Now, please pay attention. Very important points. For every rupee spent by government on National Monsoon Mission and high-performance computing programs of MOES, the country would gain economic benefits worth rupees 50. So this is 50 times. You invest rupees 1 and the return is 50 times, that is rupees 50, which is 50 times more benefit on the investment over the next 5-year period. One of the most prominent weather services of IMD is the agro-meteorological services for farmers for their day-to-day operations. So they basically tell farmers what the weather conditions are going to be, and then there are many facilities like SMS alerts and whatnot, and based on that the farmers manage their crops and they have been getting benefits of this. Similarly, Mr. Harshvardhan said that the Indian Center for Ocean Information Services provides ocean state forecasts and warning to fisher folk going to the sea every day, and that 7 lakh fishermen use these services. Very important again. The study spans across 173 rain-fed districts in 16 states and finds that based on weather advisories, 98% of farmers made modifications such as changing variety, breed of crop, arranging storage of harvest, early delayed harvesting, etc. And if you remember, they are also using AI-based solutions for such warnings and such advisories, right? Potential fishing zone advisories result in successful trips, generating additional catch. A total of rupees 1.92 crore additional income was generated. So see, this is the success of Ministry of Earth Sciences in using different technologies for disseminating information regarding weather. Now, how weather data is disseminated? The IMD, in collaboration with the Indian Council for Agricultural Research (ICAR), provides agrometeorological advisories twice a week through nearly 400 district agromet units for farmers in different parts of the country. Very, very important. Please take note. The Met Department recently started issuing block level weather forecasts and warning for farmers, and farmers in 2000 blocks receive such advisories at present, according to the government. As of today, these forecasts are disseminated through various channels, including mobile app, and that mobile app is called what? Meghdoot. So with which app they are sending messages? Through Meghdoot app and social media, Environment Minister Harshvardhan says. So this part is very, very important, how the weather data is disseminated, right? Now, I will try to share the screenshots on the PDFs of such articles, right? Because what happens, the copy of Indian Express that I get, it sometimes does not allow copying of text. So, and I have limited time, so I'll be just sharing the screenshots of important articles on the PDFs that I upload on the Telegram channel, okay? Then page 8, Center asks states to review cold chain infrastructure used for immunization. So we discussed something on this in the Hindu as well, right? Where the center said that states cannot make or should not make their own vaccine procurement and distribution plans, right? Now center is telling them to review the cold chain infrastructure, right? So it has issued specific directions to states to review their own facilities that are currently being used in the universal immunization program. Again, remember even, right? National Expert Group on Vaccine Administration for COVID-19, which has started mapping cold storage facilities across the country, including those available with the food processing industry, has also asked states to repair non-functional cold chain equipment, train staff in cold chain handling, and to hold task force meetings at block and district levels to review preparedness. Why cold chain? Because that vaccine has to be stored at a particular temperature. That temperature has to be maintained. So from source to the vaccine immunization center, it has to be maintained at a particular temperature. So that is why we need this cold chain infrastructure. And if you remember, we read that private sector has to be involved. So this is where the role of private sector comes in, right? Cold chain, including equipment and procedures used in transport, storage and handling, is a critical aspect of plan to administer the potential vaccine. They have also been asked first to prepare a priority population database and second to form a group under the chairmanship of the chief secretary at the state level on the lines of a national expert group formed for timely implementation of directions given by the center. So they are making plans for vaccine immunization, but vaccine is nowhere. Then Jaishankar urges Gulf nations to facilitate return of Indians to resume work. So just the headline, because many Indians had come back to India during this pandemic. Now he's asking them to take them back. Why? Because they are suffering, they're not having employment, and it is also compromising remittance payments, right? Then General Naravne starts Nepal visit today, will meet Oli, says it will strengthen bond between armies, will be made honorary general of Nepal army. So Indian and Nepalese army, they have this agreement where the chiefs of both armies are made honorary generals of each other's army. So he will be conferred the honorary rank of general of Nepal army, and the Nepal army chief General Thapa had received the honorary rank of general of the Indian army last year, a reciprocal agreement between the two. And if you remember, about 2 weeks back, we discussed how Mr. Oli had changed his stance regarding India maps and everything. We recently saw how he used the old map while greeting people on Dashera. Why? Because of General Naravne's visit. Then probably for the 5th or 6th time, the importance of Gilgit-Baltistan and why Pakistan has given it provisional province status. So we have discussed it so many times. So what will happen? Yesterday I told you when that happens, Gilgit-Baltistan will become the 5th province of Pakistan. I also told you about the 4 provinces, Punjab, Sindh, Balochistan and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, right? I also told you about the significance of name Pakistan. It was Chaudhry Rahmat Ali who proposed this name in 1933 in his pamphlet Now or Never, right? P stands for Punjab, AK for Kashmir, SI for Sindh, right? I discussed that with you. So Gilgit-Baltistan is the northernmost territory administered by Pakistan, providing the country's only territorial frontier and a land route with China where it meets the Xinjiang Autonomous Region. I've shown you multiple times on the map. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor has made the region vital for both countries. I've shown you so many times. Let me show you again. So see, this is Gilgit-Baltistan. Gilgit-Baltistan. This is China, Xinjiang region. So direct land contact. and this is the CPEC that is running through it. To its west is Afghanistan, and to its south is POK, and to its east is JNK. So that is the location. You can see that this is Afghanistan, this is China, this is POK, right? The plan to grant provincial status gathered speed over the last 1 year, while some commentary links it to CPEC, other with the decision of India to annul 370. We've discussed this. Now, what is the region's current status? Now, currently, Pakistan has not integrated it, right? Why? Because Pakistan wanted to keep it in a flux to maintain pressure on India to say that a plebiscite should be conducted in JNK, right? To keep it as a disputed territory. So, though Pakistan, like India, links Gilgit-Baltistan's fate to that of Kashmir, its administrative arrangements are different from those in POK. While POK has its own constitution that sets out its powers and their limits vis-a-vis Pakistan, Gilgit-Baltistan has been ruled mostly by executive fiat. Until 2009, the region was simply called Northern Areas. It got its present name only with the Gilgit-Baltistan Empowerment and Self-Governance Order 2009. So earlier it was known as the Northern Areas. Then from 2009, it officially became Gilgit-Baltistan, which replaced the Northern Areas Legislative Council with the Legislative Assembly. The NALC was an elected body but had no more than an advisory role to the Ministry of Kashmir Affairs and Northern Areas, who rule from Islamabad. So though there is no local level government which can take its own individual decisions. The Legislative Assembly is only a slight improvement. It has 24 directly elected members and 9 nominated ones. Then we discussed the Gilgit-Baltistan order in 2018, right? The government passed an order centralizing even the limited powers, and it gave powers to the Prime Minister to take decisions for that, right? Now this order was challenged, and in 2019, the Pakistan Supreme Court repealed it and asked the Imran Khan government to replace it with governance reforms. This was not done, and the status quo is that Imran Khan is calling the shots. Meanwhile, the Supreme Court, and it is not Imran Khan, let me tell you, it is the Pakistan Army. Meanwhile, the Supreme Court extended its jurisdiction to Gilgit-Baltistan. That is why India has been saying that neither the government of Pakistan or Pakistani courts have no locus standi in POK, including Gilgit-Baltistan, because they are an integral part of the Union of India, and made arrangements for caretaker government until the next legislative elections. Now, why the separate status? Again, it is telling the same thing. If you remember that earlier JNK ruler Hari Singh had given this area to the British because of its strategic importance, the great game happening in this region between the Soviet British empires, right? I've discussed all of this. And Gilgit Agency was a separate entity. It had its own army called Gilgit Scouts, right? And then it was returned to it in 1947 when the British suzerainty lapsed in India. So that is what it is telling, that on November 1, JNK ruler Hari Singh had signed the instrument of accession with India, and the Indian army had landed in the valley to drive out the tribals. But there was a rebel by the Gilgit Scouts, and they sided with the Muslim Pakistani invaders, right? And Gilgit Scouts was headed by Major William Alexander, and he basically raised the flag of Pakistan in that area. Gilgit had been leased to the British by Hari Singh in 1935 because of this, again, great game between Soviet and British empires. The British returned it in August 1947 with the lapse of suzerainty. Hari Singh sent his representative Brigadier Ghansar Singh as governor and Brown to take the charge of Gilgit Scouts. But after taking protective custody of the governor on November 1, Brown would raise. So see, these are all the white people who have created problems. The Pakistani flag at his headquarters. Later, the Gilgit-Baltistan managed to bring Baltistan under and later the Gilgit Scouts managed to bring Baltistan under their control. Pakistan did not accept its accession, although it took administrative control of the territory. After India went to the UN and series of resolutions were passed in the Security Council on the situation in Kashmir, Pakistan believed that neither Gilgit-Baltistan nor POK should be annexed to Pakistan, as this could undermine their international case for plebiscite in Kashmir. We've discussed this, so this is like 6th time we are discussing it. It also reckons that in the event a plebiscite ever takes place in Kashmir, votes will be important. Now, is granting this status a step towards Pakistan accepting the status quo? Yes, because India, for all purposes, has made it clear that this issue is dead for us, and we are saying that we will take back rest of our territory. But ground reality right now is that for all practical purposes, this LOC is sort of an international boundary. What do the people want in Gilgit-Baltistan? I've already told you they are ethnically different from people in POK. So they have been demanding full integration within Pakistan state because they have lesser rights as compared to other Pakistanis, and they have little in common with people in POK. They are largely Shia Muslims, and they do not either speak Kashmiri language nor are they culturally close to the Kashmiri people. The people have been demanding for years that it be made a part of Pakistan. They do not have the same constitutional rights as Pakistanis have. There is virtually no connect with India. Some in the past have demanded a merger with POK, but the people have no real connect with Kashmir either. They belong to several non-Kashmiri ethnicities and speak various languages. None of these are Kashmiri. A majority of the estimated 1.5 million residents are Shias. There is anger against Pakistan for unleashing extremist sectarian militant groups that target Shias. So these people, they talk of Islamic Ummah and whatnot, but they are killing each other. This buffoon of the prime minister that they have, and for dictating over the use of their natural resources. But the predominant sentiment is that it will improve once they are part of Pakistani Federation. There is small movement for independence, but it has very little traction. So again, one more article about Gilgit-Baltistan. So at least you should not have any problem when it comes to Gilgit-Baltistan. Then a small news in Ivory Coast, president declared election winner amid boycott. So Ivory Coast Electoral Commission said on Tuesday that President Alassane Ouattara has overwhelmingly won the third term in office after his two main opponents boycotted the election and called his candidacy illegal. Then China annexed 150 hectares of Nepal territory, says report. Beijing denies. So this has been reported earlier as well. Basically in 5 frontier districts they have taken Nepalese territory, and also in Pakistan they have been taking territory. Pakistan has given 2 islands in Sindh to China. So this Imran Khan druggie is selling off Pakistan to China, right? As it is, Pakistan has nothing on it. So China has annexed over 150 hectares of Nepal's territory. So China is a land-hungry country. It will take any territory it can. It has taken territory from Nepal. It has been claiming Mount Everest as its own, right? It has taken territory from Bhutan. It has taken territory from Mongolia. Even in the South China Sea, it is fighting for territory. Why? Because if you remember, once I told you 5-finger strategy of Mao Zedong, that they will keep the neighboring countries as a buffer. So it was reported by the Telegraph, quoting Nepalese politicians, reported that China annexed more than 150 hectares of land in 5 areas near the border, including by diverting the flow of a river to claim previously submerged land. So see how hungry they are for land. The Telegraph said that China allegedly began seizing Nepalese land in 5 frontier districts in May, sending members of PLA across undefended areas of the border. So basically these areas of border are in flux, and once in 2-3 months the Nepalese troops would go and they would inspect these areas. So now when they went, to their surprise, they found some buildings there. Though no one was living in those buildings, it was occupied by some Chinese troops. So that is how China basically extends its control. And it diverted a river and then it went beyond it, and then they said that this area belongs to us. But you know Mr. KP Sharma Oli, he is smitten. So you cannot actually expect Nepal to do anything. Then France says its forces killed over 50 extremists in Mali. All of them belong to Al-Qaeda. So the French military forces fighting Islamic extremists in West Africa killed more than 50 jihadists and detained 4 in an operation last week in Mali. This was reported by a defense minister. Just the headline, Europe lockdowns likely to hit demand, airlines plan flight cancellations. So second wave, and unfortunately the way things are going here, there would be a second wave in India as well, because people are not taking precautions. So folks, that is all for this video. Thank you for watching. If you like our videos, please subscribe to our channel. Also press the bell icon so that you don't miss out on any new videos, and please give us a thumbs up if you liked our videos. Also connect with us on our Instagram page, UPSC for Everyone, and please connect with us on our Telegram page where you can access the PDFs of the videos that I'll be posting daily, right? So see you next time. Till then, stay happy, stay safe, and have a great day. Namaste and Jai Hind.